You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Brooke Medina, friend of the podcast and personal friend of mine, hooked me up with a great guest I get to share with you in this episode, Tony Woodlief. Brooke and Tony both work together in the State Policy Network, an organization that believes the reason millions of people from all over have come to America seeking better lives is not because of anything Washington, D.C. or Central Authority has to offer, but that what makes us such a great nation is the strength of our communities, that Burkean, Tocquevillian self-government, that by empowering states and local governments and returning to the Founding Fathers' original formula of federalism, we could get government to work again for the people. Tony is the State Policy Network's Senior Executive Vice President and Senior Fellow, Center for Practical Federalism. Quite a mouthful of a title there, but he's more than just a Senior Vice President with SPN. He's also a writer in his own right, writing both fiction and nonfiction. I'll link to his author's website in the show note. For our purposes here, he wrote a very interesting book called I, Citizen, in which Tony argues that the real threat to our national unity isn't red versus blue, but it's the slow erosion of self-government. Now, this is an argument that, of course, can take 1,000 different forms, so in our conversation, I kind of picked Tony's brain to understand what exactly he means by that, and how federalism might offer the key to undoing this very problem. So with all this, I give you my conversation with Tony Woodlief.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
I wanted to start with something that we've all observed of late, American divisiveness, right? We're divided as a people. Nobody seems to disagree with this. But there is a bunch of disagreement, I think, as to exactly what that looks like, what color it takes, and where it may be leading us. In his book, Divided We Fall, of course, David French, his premise or his argument is essentially this: present trends cannot continue indefinitely without eventual dissolution of the United States. Now, French does therefore go on to say, look, I'm not predicting civil war. I think what's actually going to happen is a messy divorce. Nobody seems to actually want a war, and we don't seem to have the preconditions for it. That being said, there are a lot of Americans who seem to think, nope, we're headed to civil war. Like that is going to happen. Where do you stand on this? How divided are we? How realistic is disillusion? Is it something that's could be just around the corner, or if it does happen, it's going to be generations from now? Or where do you think the pulse of the United States is today?
Yeah, that's funny. In David's book, he says, I'm not predicting civil war, but then he has that fever dream in the middle of the book of how a civil war would happen between California and Texas, which is pure fantasy. So the data are pretty clear. There's a vested interest among talking heads, most people who write books about politics. They really play up this idea that there's this deep red versus blue divide. And it's not really there. Like if you look at reliable public opinion data, first of all, most Americans, they don't consider themselves to be very far on the right or the left. It's a very small minority of Americans who say, well, I'm a strong conservative, or I'm a real left-wing liberal. Most Americans don't pay that much attention to political news, especially when it's not a presidential election month. They're pretty tolerant. There's just not much evidence that people are overly invested in politics or really care that much about red versus blue. What they care about is I want a neighbor who's not going to be a jerk. And, I want to be safe in my community. So we're being sold this story by the very people who have a vested interest in it. And I talk about this some in my book, I, Citizen. Political types on the left and the right have both made it their business to try to place as much power into undemocratically controlled institutions as possible in D.C., which would mean federal agencies and courts. So they like to try to seize control of those institutions and then work their will on the rest of us, whether it's a right-wing vision or a left-wing vision. And, they get away with it by convincing all of us, oh my gosh, I guess I better vote for this guy I don't really like, because if I don't, this other guy who I like a little less will take over, and he's a fascist or a communist or whatever. So they play up this divide, and a lot of what you see, the real division is between political elites, which would mean the elected officials, their handlers and consultants, definitely their donors, their activists. Those people are absolutely far left and far right and deeply divided. But the rest of us we just aren't.
So walk me through this then, because and granted, each of us are, we can only see the little narrow window we see, but it appears to me that when I was growing up, politics wasn't quite as divisive, or at least the way we would talk about it. Now, that being said, I also remember growing up, people talking about, I have never seen the nation this divided before. This is as worse as it's ever been. But almost everybody agrees, yeah, but wow, I wished I could go back to that. That was the worst it had ever been, because it's a lot better. But I remember a lot of individuals just, leading to the preamble, say, of the Tea Party or Occupy Wall Street. That stuff was bubbling under the surface. In the 90s, I had a lot of people that just straight up believed the Clintons had committed multiple murders. Maybe they had one or two, but I mean, they were just in excess of what was even remotely feasible. But this was just commonplace. It was, the other side was evil. This was these were not elites. These were just individuals living their daily lives. Now, granted, I don't think they spent a lot of time hating on politics, but there was sort of a belief that if the other side wins, they're evil. They're going to destroy things, in a sense that I didn't necessarily think members of the United States Congress, say, felt that way about each other. They would often talk about, yeah, we disagree, but we can sit down at the table with each other. Whereas they talk about, now, I just read an article yesterday about not mine, but in Oklahoma, Representative Cole saying, this is the worst I've ever seen it. I used to just be able to get on just fine with all my Democratic counterparts, and now we can't even hardly talk to each other. So is it true that this is just the political class versus the rest of us, or is this the political class in some sense catching up to the narratives we've been telling ourselves for generations?
Yeah, there's no question the political class is more divided and more coarse, uglier towards each other. Less articulate. You've invited in a kind of a person who can follow a success path that a generation ago public officials would have considered unsavory, which is, I'm going to go out, say bombastic things on Twitter. I'm going to film myself knocking on, a congressional colleague's door to give them a piece of my mind and push that out on my socials. And it's just like, Desperate Housewives kind of behavior that we reward, in part because the activist base and the donor base on which politicians depend, at least national politicians, they are very extreme, and they respond to that. They reward that. You also had, in the beginning in the 70s, a lot of reforms, what they thought were reforms in political party nomination processes that kind of filtered down into the states and affected kind of state and local party power and influence. The rise of money, the way we kind of try to govern money actually makes it worse. You end up with all these kind of and then the media, right? So you end up with all these forces kind of combining to reward really bad behavior on the part of politicians. But the average Americans haven't changed so much. I'd say maybe we've seen a doubling in the percent of Americans since let's say the 50s, who are really drawn into that kind of extreme party allegiance. And that doubling, though, means you go from maybe 10% of the population to 20, 25%,
right,
evenly split left and right. So there's still a large base of Americans. They don't like any of this. And we see that, of course, in the reality that beginning a couple of years ago, the majority of Americans in Gallup polls say, I'm not for either party. Now, they may stay registered in a party in order to vote, right, depending on the rules in their state, like in my state of North Carolina. If I'm unaffiliated, our state laws allow me to show up on primary day and choose any party's ballot and vote on that party's primary ballot, which I really like. But some states, you don't have that option. Some states, you're not registered at all. But most Americans reject both of these product labels.
right.
They don't like them. That's exceedingly clear. The behavior of the politicians has worsened, and Americans don't like it. And yet here we are. In part, that's a function of sort of the party system and money dynamics and stuff that could be fixed. The problem is a lot of what it would take to fix it lies in the hands of the very unsavory people who now have power. And so you mentioned the Clintons, and what's interesting there is the beginning, I would say, of real self-destruction of Congress as an institution that's supposed to govern began right around the same time, not because of the Clintons. It was just this, you had Newt Gingrich, who made it a specialty to sow divisiveness. He actually handed out a little manual to his fellow Republicans that listed like awful names that you should use when you're describing your opponents. Like, he was really a divisive and diabolical force in American politics, and probably more than any single Democrat, and I'm no fan of either party, was responsible for the destruction of institutions in Congress that, man, I wish we really could get back. And that engineered a lot of Republican success, but at what cost?
Yeah, and I'm I'm going to take the temptation. Dwelling in the '90s is something we don't get too much of an opportunity to do, and I think it's weird because I think the Clinton years were very formidable, but it's almost like something we've forgotten have happened. It's amazing to me at that age, and I was very young in the '90s, but that, my political education was chiefly just listening to Untold Hours of Rush Limbaugh. So I credit him with a lot of things. I also think he got an enormous amount of things wrong. One being his view of Gingrich, but I think it set the stage for a lot of things. Let me just go off on that because I will out myself here. In my younger days, I was a big Gingrich fan, and I kind of waffled on him a little bit, especially when it became evident that he probably has about as pure a life as Bill Clinton when it comes to his sexual exploits and all sorts of other things. And who knows if we even know how deep that rabbit hole goes. But then when he runs for president in, let's see, what was that, 2012, when Romney ultimately ends up winning, I kind of got enamored with the guy again. And it was, and I, even to this day, I will admit, look, he's a brilliant debater. Like, he seems to understand in that moment exactly what the base wants to hear. And in some ways, I think he was almost a Donald Trump prototype. I mean, he was the first guy I can remember that recognized he just brilliantly handled the question in his debate, essentially something to the effect of, would you care to talk about all these affairs you've had? And his response was essentially, no, but I will. And then he spent the entire time attacking the press because you guys are focused on this when in the meanwhile the nation's doing this. And it was brilliant, not so much because it pivoted, but because I think it immediately registered with something that was on the right that day, which is that the press hates us. We're always one step behind. The elites are against us. This guy's actually fighting them, in a way that Trump seemed to later. I'm wondering if we can just dwell on this for a little bit. So let me be very clear. I agree with you. Gingrich was more destructive than he was positive. But he's also, that model seems to be something that works. There's a reason your Lauren Boeberts and your Matt Gaetz and your Donald Trumps are in power, even as the nation keeps claiming we don't want these people. It's not like your cerebral politicians that are just very quiet and get the job done and speak about unity. They're not the ones on the ascent at the moment. Is there some form of recognizing that the Gingriches of the world have something right, that the populace wants to understand, yes, I get it. The elites are against you. The elites have screwed up. We need to recognize that. We need to address that. But we're not just going to destroy the institutions. I'm not just going to be a grifter, if you will.
Right. I think that's exactly right, that there's a formula there, or there's a set of practices that do help you win in the political field of combat. And, we saw this even in the 50s when the Republicans realized, gosh, our platform sounds exactly like the Democrats. Like, they were trying to get more polarization, which is actually good from the standpoint of the if you think the voter is the consumer. I don't want a Henry Ford, the same car from every party. Give me some diversity of choice. So that's good. And I think even I found it distasteful, but the Gingrich, list of names to call your opponents, that's kind of marketing in the end. And okay, fine, you can do that. make it a little ugly if you want. I think the real destruction was the subsequent alteration of the institutions of Congress, whether it's kind of restricting average member power to get things to the floor or even to committee. Committees sort of held in the hands of leadership, most of the staff shifting to leadership. Like, you make all these changes that centralize power in the institution, in part because you have these razor thin margins between Democrat and Republican. And so you end up like the stakes are higher.
Which I'm sorry to interrupt, but let me just clarify there. That happens under Gingrich, and we've, if I'm not mistaken, never really recovered from that trajectory.
That's correct. That's right. And so you have now, part of the reason you don't get those reforms is because each party has such a small margin. Once they get power, it's too tempting for them to go ahead and use that centralized authority to ram through as much as they can, because they know they only have a couple of years before then the other party comes back. And what you would hope, of course, is that you could have enough mature adults who could get together and call a truce. But you're dealing with fundamentally untrustworthy people, right? They're politicians. And so we're kind of stuck. And that's why then presidents defer to federal agencies. They try to get things done. We remember Barack Obama. I have my phone and my pen.
Right.
Bragging about it in the institution of Congress. He's going to behave in an undemocratic manner somehow to save democracy. But that's become the new norm, is to govern through federal agencies and through courts, which is really the destruction of American representative democracy.
So what do you, because if you listen to the partisan, Democrat or Republican, their standard response, let's take Obama's side, is, well, of course he said that. The Republican Party made it enormously clear for years they would not work with him. They were going to do everything in their power to try to distort what he was trying to do. A lot of Republicans would say the same thing. When the Democrats are in charge of Congress, they will not work with us. It's not a matter of we're not willing to come to the tables. Even if we were, they've made it clear that that's not what they're up to. Like, is this a simple matter of where we're both claiming something that's not true? There actually is willingness to work with each other. What do you actually, because this is where my friends often push back, is like, well, what do you do when the other party genuinely does not want to compromise?
Well, I think a part of it, this is sort of from let's say, just average person who's educated enough, interested in this question, these institutions. I think part of it is with changing the mindset. Like, it's standard now for a president to run for office and say, I'm going to give you all these things. And they're primarily domestic things. I'm going to give you these benefits, make these changes. But really, the institutions are designed for Congress to make those decisions about domestic policies. What will we spend money on? What are our budget priorities? What are the laws? And then the job of the president was more outward focused on national defense, diplomacy with other nations. Then, of course, making sure that the executive branch faithfully executes the laws and the budget given to it by the Congress, by the legislature. And so I think what's happened, and we see this corrosion in our thinking, even in how we talk about the Electoral College, we've come to believe that all our domestic policy is sort of determined by plebiscite, and then the president represents he is the embodiment of all those domestic national desires, when instead, no, this system means Congress sorts that out, and they're going to fight, and they're mostly not going to agree. And so what's the lesson? Most of this stuff should probably happen in states and communities, because if you're waiting on Washington to do it, it ain't going to happen on purpose.
Right. I'm not going to let you bait me this early in the conversation into a lengthy federalism, which is where I want to go. I want to talk federalism, but I want to stay on the idea of the divisiveness of the United States for just a moment longer. Your book, of course, I, Citizen. By the way, is that a homage to iPencil?
Well, that was my publisher. They had a debate internally, I found out. So there's three possibilities. One could be iPencil. Mm-hmm. Right, which is a great essay. Everybody should go read that. It's a great example of how you specialization gives you more output. It could be iRobot, or it could be iClaudius. So the Robert Graves novel. Yeah.
Okay, so choose your own adventure title.
Yeah.
I was going to ask, because you make a distinction there between, I guess, what we commonly call the elites versus the people, with the political class versus the rest of us. So what is the difference in your view between, air quotes, the elites versus what you're calling the political class?
Well, there's obviously some overlap, but elite, at least it still has some connotation that I think we ought to consider to be positive. You could be an elite athlete. You could be an elite student. You could be among the economic elite because you created a lot of value for your fellow man and they rewarded you with dollars and cents. So elites, the idea that if you have achieved some exalted status through your performance, maybe just through your birth or through your looks, that's bad and should be punished, I'm trying to stay away from. And so I wanted to concentrate on the people who've made it their business to divide us. So that would be, in my view, the political class. It is literally their business to divide human beings and to attack the other side to gain power over us.
Made it their business because it is in their nature to do so? In other words, they've chosen this, or made it their business because they are working in occupations that structurally are designed to do so? And the reason I'm asking that is would a better world be one in which the political class simply doesn't exist because we don't have things like lobbyists and political activists? Or is it, no, that's necessary, we're going to have those, we just need to find some way to mitigate their darker impulses?
I think the latter. I mean, humans are humans. I think, I've spent enough time in DC over the years to, without disparaging any particular individuals, there's a lot of people here who just love this game. They don't ever want it to end. And those people, in my view, are a cancer on the country in both parties. How could you love this awful, awful game they play? Some people just do. And they're bad people. Were they bad before they came to DC? A lot of them, sure. Did they get worse when they got here? Absolutely. With that said, the nature of politics is going to have division. We're going to argue about who should be in a position of power for a certain period of time. And then we do a lot to try to limit them. So to your point, this is what the founders recognized, is that you cannot take all self-interest out of man. It's just inherent. We are fallen creatures, which is why we need a government. And so that the system they designed, all the checks and balances and division of power between the states and the national government, was on purpose a recognition of human character. And so that's why it's really rich now to hear so many people in the political class complain about how they can't get stuff done in Washington. That was the whole bloody point, because this is how people are.
The way you're speaking is similar sometimes to how I argue about certain things. And I have found that when I have these conversations, I have to be careful to distinguish between a strictly, say, populist worldview and one that I think is more akin to a Burkean conservatism, if you will. And what I mean by that is I think there are individuals that could hear most of what you've said so far and say, he is essentially a populist. It is the people, the right people, versus the political class, the wrong people. Is that a fair charge, or would you distinguish between what you're trying to say? If it's not, how would you distinguish between a populist worldview and what you're describing?
Well, I think, historically, populism, in my view, in America gets a bad rap. It arose at a time when people were trying to push back against what they perceived, at least, to be controlled by the powerful of their communities, whether that was through financial markets and farming or the laws. So it had a more left wing kind of bent, what we now would call left wing. Although now everything's topsy turvy, so a lot of what the populists stood for, the so-called populists today stand for, depending on who you're talking about. I think the primary change between what we call populism in America today and the sort of earlier kind of version of it is there is a great mixture of nationalism built in, and depending on who you're talking to. And the populists, we have to remember, were also, many of them, very anti-war. They didn't want to have military adventures. They wanted to, protect their homes and their homeland. Whereas now there is this, among at least some self-styled populists, a kind of America against the world kind of mentality that I think would not be recognizable to the earlier sort of generation of populists.
Well, I think one of the things that the populism, and here I don't mean inherently left or right populism, just the worldview in general, tends to have with it is almost a tinge of an idea of Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, that we could right wrongs by putting the average yokel in power, which sort of implies our problems are easy to solve. it's simply a matter of getting the bad people away from the levers of power and putting the good people there?
Well, I I think the more, if you think about it like sort of a math problem in part, right? You've got millions and millions of people in this country who have different needs and wants and beliefs, capacities. That means that the problems we face, we can have shared problems or perceived problems. Like if we're on the edge of nuclear war with Russia, we all share that problem. Maybe people in major cities more than people out in the middle of Nebraska, but we all share that problem. Other problems are very particularized. One family may be dealing with opioid addiction, and another family's dealing with unemployment. Another family's dealing with kids are addicted to their iPhones. It's different stuff. So the more we try to solve our problems from a single city that isn't even a part of a state, probably the more trouble we're going to run into, because you have to force more compromises. And this would be, whenever we get to it, that's the chief, in my view, argument for federalism, is you give communities more self-determination. And communities are probably more likely to have a closer sort of assembly of problems among them than people spread across the country have.
Well, let's get to it, because I said I was putting a pin in federalism, and that is certainly a large part of what I wanted to talk to you about. You, of course, you work with the State Policy Network, and I imagine just temperamentally you were this way even before you began with them. We probably shared a certain degree a notion that, or let me put it this way, I feel like federalism holds a lot of the answers to getting us out of this gridlock mess we seem to find ourselves in. And I'm not one who thinks that Congress just needs to get things done. Sometimes they do. Sometimes I'm perfectly happy when they're not doing anything. But whether or not they're doing things or not doing things, nobody seems happy with this present system. Nobody seems represented by this present system, other than maybe a very small slice of the most radical activists who happen to be in power at the moment. So for the average listener, because we use this term all the time, but can you just break down for us, what do we mean by federalism? Like, what is that? And why is that so important to the fabric of the United States?
Well, so then federalism at a theoretical level, it could apply in any country, and it generally refers to some separation or division of power between a national government and then some subunits of government. And you could have all kinds of distributions of that power and so on. In the American context, it means that the national government was literally created by the states, which were, bound in a confederation, but had a great deal of sovereignty. And they created the Constitution, created a national government. They did not give all their sovereignty away. They gave that national government certain enumerated powers. And the whole idea was, there's some stuff we're not going to be able to figure out as a confederation. We're just going to keep messing it up, whether it's what's our money or national defense or who's going to control and pay the debt. So they enumerated those powers and said a national government will do that better. But in that enumeration, they were very clear: if we didn't name this thing, you don't have this power. And then, of course, you end up with the Bill of Rights as part of that effort to try to make sure that that national government stayed constrained. So that's the idea: is federalism means division of power between a limited national government and state governments.
So I want to ask about this nation of federalism I'm going to call this federalism of spirit or of heart, because I think on the one hand, you can have very informed, good arguments as to why this makes sense for a nation of 330 plus million people. As you mentioned, it's not just for the United States. There's all sorts of divisions of, hey, dividing your central authority into the various regions of this nation is probably going to be more representative and less given to, say, an authoritarian spirit. But I think there's also a sense in which federalism might imply a notion of how we see our allegiance to the country as a component, sort of I mentioned Burke earlier, a Burkean small platoon. This is one of the things he critiqued the French on, the French Revolution, was that they were sort of arbitrarily dividing the country in these sort of geometric shapes rather than where they had naturally, culturally developed over years. And, an example I think maybe would be helpful, I use often in my mind, is I am from Tulsa, Oklahoma. Now, not everybody knows where that is, but a good number of people know where Tulsa is. But when I say that, those individuals who know where that is, I think almost without question, assume I mean the city of Tulsa. It just so happens I currently live in Broken Arrow in Tulsa County. I could have meant the county, but the county is just a geographic shape that the state carved up one day. Tulsa is something that you feel in your bones. And I actually am from Tulsa. That's where I grew up. That's where, Broken Arrow is a community on the south side of Tulsa, but it's something that has history and depth and root, and it's something that you can have a sense of pride in, to the point that when you say Tulsa, Oklahoma, you just take for granted I meant the city, not the county. And so is there a sense in which a federalism, because I know when we start as a nation, the 13 original colonies, and they often talked about prior to the Civil War, it's the United States are, meaning the states collectively are, and now it's the United States is, as if we're a single thing. And I know this gets a little muddy, because then when you get to a state like mine, Oklahoma, you kind of create the state out of the shape that's left over because of all the other states that were around it. So it's hard to say, well, is it the people out in the Panhandle, are they really the same as those in Tulsa, sort of thing, in the same sense that Maryland was different than Georgia? All that being said, help me understand, is it more than just a very clever political scheme as to how to disseminate power? Is there actually something about the human species that needs to recognize the kernel of, here's where my affection lies, so that I can build up to a national level? I first have to recognize my duty within this local place.
I think so. I mean, we naturally care more about our families than we do about strangers. We tend to care more about, or feel more strongly, things that happen in our communities than it happened on the other side of the world. I think we're all a little bit suspicious of that person who's always evincing love for mankind in the abstract, but isn't very loving towards the actual men and women in their own lives. And we know people like that. And they tend to be the more in the political class, right? So I think normal, well-adjusted, healthy people inherently are attached more to community, that we have more nostalgia for home than we do for some house we visited once. I think that is normal. And so you end up with a more rootedness. And that Tocqueville talked about that. He talked about the kind of a shallow French patriotism that could be whipped up into a fervor so they could be, cannon fodder in their wars. But it wasn't the same as a community rooted kind of government like he saw, developing in America.
When we talk about federalism, I think the average, and I would put myself in this class. I'm an individual who's all for it, but I'm a little ignorant as to what exactly is going wrong at the federal level. I've got a concept that, the federal government's doing too much. And I think you're the perfect person to ask this of, since you're with the State Policy Network. What tangibly is, say, like a realistic 2 to 5 year plan, say? If you had your druthers, could we do to begin to reverse this? Where is the low-hanging fruit? Where are the things that the federal government, we could probably most politically and easily and economically just say, okay, Fed, stop doing this. We're going to let the states take over?
That's a good question. So the economist John Cogan, he's out at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. He ran all these numbers and he said, look, let's go back to the original intended powers of the national government. I just referred to the enumerated powers as sort of the legal term, right? And he said, all right, what if we add on top of those enumerated powers Social Security and Medicare, which is the medical care and support for the elderly, but also orphans, the disabled, and so on. So we have that kind of basic safety net, and we have the enumerated powers. He said, what if we had limited the federal government to just those things? The debt today would be zero. And instead, we're looking at, what is the current count? 36 trillion in debt. We're getting to the point where interest on the debt will be the highest budget item. We're in trouble.
Yeah.
And it's being driven by this expansiveness of the federal government to what used to be the responsibilities of states and localities and, private citizens. So they're connected. Federalism is connected to the financial integrity and survival of the country. So where do you begin? You have to begin there, and then you look at what are some of the drivers of that pending bankruptcy, like the one that's the big debate right now. It looks like the Republicans are going to fold on. They had some opportunity to deal with Medicaid, which is the medical care and so on for people who are unable to care for themselves. That was the original intent, and it's expanded over time. Of course, under Obama, they expanded it to the able-bodied below a certain income level. And then under Biden, you saw an expansion beyond that. So now we're looking at, as a nation, spending, I think, $800 billion a year all in on Medicaid, and that's growing. And the problem with it is we created this perverse incentive where the federal government will give a state $9 for every dollar that state spends on able-bodied adults without dependent children who are on Medicaid, but $1.33 for every dollar that same state spends on, say, a disabled child. So it's an immoral policy that has led states to radically expand that dependent population, and then also tolerate all kinds of fraud among healthcare providers, because the states can then tax that excess and essentially get a cut of the fraud. And members of both parties have recognized that for what it is and have called it fraud. So I'd start there. You see a lot of states, this is fascinating to me, Maine, Kansas, I'm trying to remember, a handful of other states are either entertaining or have passed laws that restrict the use of their state National Guard by the president, only to instances where Congress has declared war. And that's a recognition that we've had this long-running military adventurism, primarily at the hands of Republican presidents, but certainly not entirely. We've squandered American lives and treasure. We've killed hundreds of thousands of people overseas. And you might say, for what? And we've done it on the cheap, right? Because often a National Guard soldier is going to be, they're not going to have the same level of benefits and pay as a U.S. serviceman, one of the traditional branches. So you have states saying, no more, right? If Congress declares a war, as it's supposed to, according to the Constitution, then we'll send our men and women into that conflict, but you can't use them as pawns in your, games that are not even really authorized by the Constitution. So that might be another place to start, given the incredible devastation we see in this country as a legacy of those adventures in the Middle East. And I'm sure, there are budget experts you can get on here who could find 50 other ways to save
sure,
and restore federalism. But to me, those stick out because one is bankrupting the country financially. The other has, in some ways, bankrupted us morally. And there's such a long-term legacy of cost at all levels because of that.
It seems to me there's a natural disincentive to empower the states to do these things for a lot of reasons, but one of them being just the practical economics of it. So it's often observed, look, the federal government can print its own money. It can incur debt in a way that states can incur debt supposedly, but they really have to balance their budgets in a way that the feds don't. Now, in reality, we all have to balance our budgets. It's going to catch up to us eventually. There's a big difference between, we're running a deficit at the federal level for entitlement programs. All right, let's just float another $1 trillion worth of debt that other countries will happily buy up because they presume we're going to be financially solvent. So it works for them, it works for us. If we suddenly, and I think that's why I asked about low-hanging fruit, because in my mind, the only way to really do this is to slowly, deliberately, cautiously reverse some things. Could be wrong. But it seemed like if we just all of a sudden said, okay, everything other than those entitlement programs you mentioned and the original enumerated powers, the feds are just going to completely stop it. It's up to you states to get this stuff done. It seems like that would result in almost immediate economic devastation. Because the reality is we're living on borrowed time. This is only working because we keep floating debt. States can't do that in the same way the feds can. It seems like it's difficult to reverse engineer because it's like, first you have to recognize we're living on borrowed time. Like the way we're currently behaving literally does not work, but we can temporarily keep this going. But if we kicked it back to the states, it'd just have to completely cease to exist.
Yeah. Average state gets, I believe it's at this point, average or the median state, I think it's the average, 36% of its spending comes from federal sources. Some states, it's over 50%, like Louisiana and Alaska. So they're fundamentally dependent on federal agencies. And, my conservative friends bear some responsibility for this because in a lot of states, they happily take that federal money so they can cut their taxes. And I like a tax cut like everybody else. And certainly we've seen, a state like California losing business by the hundreds and thousands of businesses because their taxes compared to, say, a Texas or a Florida. But we have to recognize when you diminish your own revenue base in a state, it's all the harder to tell the Department of Education no when they want to do their transgender bathrooms or whatever it is. It's hard to say no to these federal bullies when you've made yourself so dependent on them. So I think that, we're going to have to recognize, if we want states to do more, they're going to have to think differently about how they govern themselves. And I think, yes, you would have this massive dislocation because you've got so much of these funds flowing to places where they probably don't belong, whether it's able-bodied adults who could be working more, whether it's bloated university administrations, filled with people making six figures who don't do a lick of classroom teaching. You would have fundamental dislocations. A lot of people would have their lives upended. And I think conservatives need a science of deconstruction. If you think back to the wall comes down in Germany, right? And suddenly freedom in Eastern Europe, man, that was a mess. Like people didn't know, well, how much are we supposed to charge for an egg? There was no price system, and it was really painful. And in some places like Russia, a bunch of crooks who were in bed with the government in the first place, crooks and murderers, they became the new plutocrats. Nothing changed, really. It just changed hands a little bit, the power and the money. So there's a way to deconstruct a government, and I don't think conservatives think about it enough, in part because we don't like government. But I think about it like this, like an oncologist doesn't like cancer, but she sure makes it her business to understand at a cellular level how the cancer works and how do you get rid of it. And I think my conservative friends who don't like government need to have the same mentality.
That's a good point. And as you mentioned, tax cuts that conservative states, red states, if you will, happily take federal money and then use it to reduce their burdens elsewhere. I'm reminded not that long ago here in Oklahoma, our own governor, Kevin Stitt, and let me go on the record, I like tax cuts just as much as the next guy, but what I like more than tax cuts is fiscal responsibility. Because I think ultimately, if you cut taxes, you're not fiscally responsible, it's going to end up costing you more than if you just hadn't cut the taxes. But Kevin Stitt was essentially campaigning on the notion that we ought to make permanent tax cuts based on his stellar leadership as governor and how the state was in an economic windfall, that we had a surplus. What was left out of that statement was, well, we have a surplus because between the original Trump and the Biden administrations, we've received an additional $1 billion in COVID relief that could be spent on all sorts of state projects. So what happens when you're out of office? The feds are no longer paying us an additional $1 billion, and now we have permanent tax cuts. And the reason I bring this up is because I think it's and again, I can imagine through process of time these things work themselves out. But part of me is scared about the notion of, well, wait a minute. If we returned power to the states, it's going to be yahoos like that in charge of our lives? Like maybe we're better off with the elite political class running things.
It's a good question. Like I've thought about that. If you return more authority to states, and I would say and communities, because I'm not just
right
political science federalist, but also at I guess maybe an ethical level, a federalist, a localist. For all kinds of reasons. Can people govern themselves? Can they make the hard choices about, what to do in the school with the child who was born a girl and now believes she's a boy? Like, what are we going to do about this child in our community versus some ideological bureaucrats in Washington handing down a rule from afar? I want to believe the community can do it better and with more compassion. But that's an article of faith on my part. I base it on just having lived in a number of communities and seeing that when times are hard, not everybody, but enough people lean into that and do something like the right thing. And I think for a lot of folks who are listening, maybe the closest analogy is if you've ever had jury duty or ever watched a jury closely, these are generally people from all walks of life. Maybe even weighted more towards the lower class, right? Because intellectuals and wealthier people know how to get out of jury duty more easily. But if you ever watch a jury, if you ever served on one, these are just regular people who are diverse, and they really take it seriously. I mean, they want to do the right thing and administer justice when called to step forward and shoulder that responsibility. And I think that's what gives me faith, that if you gave communities more authority, you would see a similar kind of rise to that responsibility.
So let me push back on what you're saying there, and I largely agree. But my friends on the left, I think, have a natural hesitancy about this notion of we could disseminate or we could federalize in this sense, because oftentimes the examples they'll push back on is, well, what about Jim Crow era? What about civil rights? What about evidence in which it's very clear those local communities did not behave in a way that was good or righteous or conducive to good government? Is it not? And sometimes I'll even hear them talk about, acknowledge, yes, I get that if we allow the free market to do X, it would likely service more people. But I cannot abide the fact that it necessarily will harm some people. And there's nothing we can do about that unless we centralize power to ensure that those individuals are not harmed.
Well, I mean, if you centralize power, there's no reason to believe that a bunch of 30-year-old Strom Thurmonds won't take charge of it. Yes, in our history, historically, Americans have done bad things to minority populations of all kinds. And in some cases, that was rectified or at least ameliorated by national intervention. The risk is if you make that permanent, that rule from Washington, you have to be ready for the worst kinds of people to take that power, which is why I like my progressive friends I go to church with, let's say. This is always my gentle, not even a rebuttal, but suggestion when they're upset and they want to go back to the Obama years and the phone and the pen and let's fix some things. And I just remind them, if you put all that power there, well, I don't know, you might end up with, hypothetically, a president with that power who is exactly the opposite of what you want. This is the whole argument against too much power in the national government. And I think we also have to remember that, Americans are not, this is not 1930s America. The people are more tolerant than on a number of dimensions than they were in the 1930s. And I think mostly for the better. And so I don't believe we would see communities reintroduce Jim Crow or whatever else. But what we have to keep in mind, too, when we talked about federalism, American federalism, is it's a division of power between the national government and the states. There's also an understanding that those, you have these fundamental rights that can't be taken away from you by any level of government. And so there is sort of a safeguard there.
Yeah, fun fact, if you if you had divided Strom Thurmond's age by 30s, you'd end up with 3 of them. Strom Thurmond's in their 30s. I was trying to envision what that even looked like.
Yeah.
So Yuval Levin, in his book, The American Covenant, makes this interesting point that I'm sure he's not the first to make this, but it was a light bulb went off in my head. I was like, oh, I never even thought about that. He talks about federalism ought to be thought about not just as a matter of the separation between the federal government and the states. In other words, hey, state and local communities do these things, and it's not just a formula. But he said it ought also to be seen as there are things that are naturally more accustomed to be given to a national control or a state or local control. And I think maybe the example that comes to mind the easiest is the military. We would be in an awful fix if we were dependent on all 50 states to produce the military and there was no central authority. Obviously, that sort of thing needs to be nationalized, especially in time of war. But there are other things that just by their nature, it's not something the federal government should be doing. And I think the reason that's important is because often it seems like what we have is there's a federal Department of Housing and Human Services. Hey, there's a state version of that. There's a federal Department of Transportation. Hey, there's a state version of that. We have duplication of all these services. So in an ideal world that embraces federalism, would there necessarily be either, I won't even say a diminishing of, but an actual elimination of certain state or federal functions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you get back to what are the enumerated powers, and do you need a Department of Transportation? Do you need a Department of Education? These departments, even if they began with good intentions, like how can we spread the best educational practices? Or what if, if Mississippi has more children who have learning disabilities and economic challenges that make educating them more expensive, do we as a country want to take a little bit of every other state's income and help Mississippi out? Maybe Congress says, yeah, we do. And maybe that explains a lot of federal agency, creation. But we've seen across the board, when you give them that authority, they go from those sort of minimal stated goals of let's ensure educational excellence in every state or whatever it might be to abuse of power. And I think that comes back to this is what the founders warned about, and what every human, every preacher, and every child understands is that people tend to do bad things with power while telling themselves that they're being virtuous. So you want to restrict it. And that's part of the argument for keeping the federal government out of education and a heck of a lot of other stuff, because at the very minimum, even though you're going to have just as many potentially bad people in states as you do in Washington, D.C., there's some competition and exit possibility and all those things that would keep those bad people in states in check. And they're closer to home. It's easier to get rid of a bureaucrat in your state Department of Education who's putting a finger on the scales than it is to get rid of one of them in D.C.
So one of the things I've heard, that a manner in which the federal government can abuse its authority over states is in the guidance that they provide, federal agencies provide down to local governments. And this is something that I must admit I'm not entirely clear in my mind how this works, because I get how the federal government holds authority over states when, as you mentioned, 36% of their budget is coming from the federal government. And honestly, that makes a lot of sense to me. I work in the audit industry, and I've often said to local, I don't say this directly to local governments, but I say this among my fellow auditors, you do have the option to just not take the money. If you don't want to comply with all these rules, just don't take the money. And there were some local governments that did that. Incidentally, in Oklahoma, there were a couple of counties that didn't get their COVID dollars, not for some political reason, but because they didn't know they were supposed to ask for it. So it's probably best they didn't get the money, because who knows how they would have spent it. But the reason I say that is because, to me, that makes a lot of sense. I get why the federal government has so much power over local governments. It makes sense. You took our money, now you're going to play by our rules. But why is it something like a federal guideline? Like, why is it something that is an interpretation of a rule would necessarily hold sway over state or local governments? Like, could the state or local government not simply say, look, we appreciate the guidelines, but we've got our own interpretations of these? Is it a simple matter of they've got the central authority, they've got the research behind it, and we don't want to reinvent the wheel? Or is that actually holding some sway over the local governments?
Yeah, think about it like this. So Congress, they vote on some bucket of money, usually in some gigantic omnibus bill. Most of them haven't read, but Congress on paper authorizes the federal government to hand out some money to the states for some purpose. Then the federal agency that's charged with doing that writes some rules that are part of the grant agreement from the federal government to the state. And those rules are supposed to, articulate and embody what Congress intended. Now, so that's the first place we see monkey business, because more and more agencies, if Congress says, you know what, we want to hand out some money for highway construction because our highways and bridges are getting too old and a lot of states can't afford to fix them, and people are going to start falling in the rivers and lakes if we don't do something. So boom, we just passed a bill. Department of Transportation gets it, and they're supposed to then set up the rules of the game for states to apply for that money. But what do they add? They add, our reading of the law is you have to have so many minority firms that are going to build your bridges, and you have to make sure that left-handed transgender children get phonics instruction on the side of the road while their parents are working on the roads. Like, they add all these things that are not germane to the intention of the Congress, and so that's one step where they misbehave. But then the step after that, so the state has applied for the money. They receive the federal grant. They sign what is in effect like a contract, and that's one whole can of worms that we could get into. But now they're getting the money. What happens is you have hundreds of thousands of what we call regulated parties in America, and these are people who are subjected to some federal regulation or another, and often they want more clarity about what the law says. And so they'll ask for it, and the agency will issue something called guidance, which is non-binding, by law, non-binding. It's an effort to explain the law. So the regulated party can be confident, okay, I'm obeying the law. Great example. Congress years ago passed a law, and they said, look, if you offer a health insurance plan in this country, and you provide a certain set of benefits for people who have, let's say, mental challenges, some mental health challenges, like maybe you offer so much money per day for hospitalization for so many days a year, and so much money that could be used for pharmaceuticals to treat these conditions. If you do that, you also have to offer an equivalent amount of non-medical or let's say non-pharmaceutical or hospitalization interventions. So like counseling, outpatient counseling, that kind of thing. Well, golly, Pete, like some of those pills could be $200 a pop, and counseling could be community counseling with volunteers that has no real cost. So the insurance companies were all lining up and asking the government, oh, okay, well, here's our counseling options. Does this comply? So the agency issues a piece of paper or a volume. You got guidance. Wonderful. It works great. But what happened, starting especially in the Obama years, and then it was insane in the Biden years, is agencies began issuing guidance that nobody asked for. Nobody asked for clarity. And that guidance was basically new regulations without any transparency, without any oversight, any opportunity to review in courts, because it was passed off as clarification. But the regulated parties understood if they didn't do it, they might lose the grant money. They might have Department of Justice flying in a bunch of lawyers and accusing them of committing crimes. And so what I've found working with state leaders, they're intelligent people and they want to do the right thing. Many of them don't understand that guidance is not legally binding. And so that created a problem. And so like one example that was really pernicious under Obama, they resurrected it under Biden, the Department of Justice and Department of Education, federal departments, told all the school districts in America, we're concerned about the disparities in school discipline between Black students, Latino students, white students, Asian students. We've got racial disparities. We are going to, I'm just paraphrasing, we're going to presume if there's a disparity, you were engaged in discrimination. And so then they gave a long list of school districts where they'd seen disparities, they sent in their DOJ lawyers, and lo and behold, in every single one of those instances, they found discrimination.
Right.
And then the school district agreed to fix it. So the message was very clear. If you're a school administrator, like that's your nightmare scenario, is 4 Department of Justice lawyers show up one day and you're indicted in the press as a racist, right? So what happened? Around the country, schools began to look at the race of the child before deciding whether to suspend or expel the child for misbehavior. And now if you know any public school teachers, you know what they're dealing with, which is they've got discipline problems out the wazoo. They've got violence in schools, and it's all rolled up under this guidance that was never legal in the first place. So that's really it's an abrogation of democracy, and it's a just growing problem that someone has to address. And that's one of the things my team works on at the Center for Practical Federalism.
And we're definitely grateful you're there doing that. And this seems like, the old conservative argument is, I'm trying to put this, as an auditor who had to read all 435 pages of the original interim final rule, not to be confused with the final rule or the subsequent other interim final rule, presumably we're going to get another final rule eventually, of the state and local fiscal recovery funds for Biden's response to COVID. That's a mouthful. It was interesting to me because it looked like so much of those 435 pages were just aspirational. It wasn't necessarily direct. It wasn't saying you have to spend the money this way. It was more a recognition of here's how we want the money to be spent. And as I'm reading through that, it occurs to me this is not necessarily people acting with ill intent. Some of them are, obviously. But these are not necessarily ideologically driven individuals trying to force local governments to do something via their language. It's rather individuals probably who think they're doing a public good. And in so doing, this behemoth of the federal government has become so complicated that it requires an hour to untangle a very specific rule to eventually get down to, oh, I don't have to do that. That was just aspirational. And in a sense, it's almost like it's no one's fault. And so this goes back to the original conservative argument of, well, maybe rather than making government more efficient, which we've been talking about doing for generations, maybe we should just limit it. Maybe we should stop doing as many things as it's doing. And I'm bringing this up because I guess my closing question here is, we on the right have been talking about limiting government for almost a century now. Is hope even warranted at this point? Like, what is there any evidence that we're going to be successful at some point in convincing enough people, hey, we need to limit government?
That's a good question. Like I'm watching in Washington. I'm in Washington right now, and I see the Republicans. They have razor thin margins, right, in Congress. They control Congress. They control the White House, and the die is cast in terms of public perception about what they're up to. Like they're going to be labeled as gutting Medicaid, no matter what they do. You would think, given we're on the precipice of bankruptcy as a country, that they would go ahead and reform it. And they're not gonna. So that would suggest to me, if I know you asked about conservatives, and I'm talking about Republicans.
Those are not necessarily the same thing.
Yeah. I think that Americans don't like either party, and there are opportunities to reform those parties, especially with the rise of independents and more states that go to a partially closed or open primary where independents can vote in either primary. There are opportunities to reform at the party level. And I think that's where it's going to have to begin, is if you care about this stuff, believe it or not, that tells me go work at the precinct level, either with organizing independents or take over one of the parties at that local level. And you got to send different people to Washington. It would be one step. But the short answer is no. I don't see evidence that the trend is headed in the right direction. However, I'm encouraged by the fact that Americans remain staunchly apolitical, which is actually a good thing. It's like an inoculation against the virus of partisanship. And so if there's some way to harness that and empower them, beginning at the local level, that to me would be how you eventually reform Congress and make it a legislating institution again.
Well, I guess that's an appropriately cautiously optimistic note to end on. Tony Woodlief, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the Saving Elephants program.
Thanks for having me, Josh.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.